Hello and welcome to the World Lens podcast, where once a week we take a look at what's happening through a global business perspective. Once again, subbing in for Michelle Evans, my name is Curtis Sprung, editor on this podcast, and I am joined, as always, by Bruce McIndoe, president of McIndoe Risk Advisory and a WTCI board member. Welcome, Bruce.
Hey, good having a chance to talk with you, Curtis. It's great.
Thanks so much for having me back. So today we are jumping back to Asia, specifically to discuss the South China Sea, which, according to the things that I've read online, we can say that China and the Philippines have been, let's say, feuding.
Headbutting.
Headbutting. So Bruce, let's talk about this, and let's focus on these. I read it. It's the Spratly Islands. Am I saying that correctly?
Sure, Spratly.
And this archipelago out in the South China Sea, what is going on over there? China is very aggressively defending its claims.
Yeah, so let's start out with when people ask me, where do I think there could be major, kinetic action between the US and China, people, always assume I'm going to say Taiwan. But I always tell them I'm more concerned about what's happening in the South China Sea.
Okay.
So we'll talk about that more today. But let's talk about the Spratly Islands, because for most people, when you think about islands, right, you're thinking, beaches and that kind of thing, and that's not what this is at all.
Okay.
In fact, the islands consist of what would be technically 19 islands. Okay. And then there's, I don't know, half a dozen banks and hundreds of reefs and even submerged structures that are very dangerous for shipping, right? So you've got all these, areas that constitute what are the Spratly Islands, and they sit in the South China Sea, and that area consists of kind of the Philippines, Malaysia, southern Vietnam, and so there's all that, like who actually owns them. We can talk about that, and but it's a very disputed area, and China has been very aggressive in wanting to establish, their ownership and control of these islands in this particular area of the South China Sea.
When I was doing some research on this, it seems like there's some sort of historic claim that China can make, but also probably some of those other countries as well.
Yeah,
But
Brunei, Malaysia, all of them, or Taiwan, have all made claims. So go ahead.
so what is it? What is the tangible benefit that these islands provide that it's such a big deal? Is it are there natural resources there? Is
So
it you
yeah,
said
so
that
that's so okay. There are no indigenous inhabitants of these islands.
okay.
Okay, so there's no like DNA lineage that says, this is Chinese or whatever, right? So this is just a bunch of land, I would say artifacts, but just the islands and the reefs and all that kind of stuff. The the total land area of the Spratly Islands, now this is going to like blow your mind, is 490 acres.
Oh my gosh.
That's it.
That's not much.
But it's spread over 160,000 square miles.
Okay.
Right? So if you can own this 490 acres of landmass, you now control 160,000 square miles of fishing, potential, oil and gas reserves, and all of that, plus whether it's 3, 5, or 12 nautical miles of being able to control that as your territorial waters, right? And so that's what China's after, right? By declaring that we now are settled here. They've created, Air Force bases and all kinds of things on these, and they created their own islands, right, to build this.
Right.
They now can declare that this is China.
So this is about really potential future gains, or is it really the controlling like shipping and fishing in there? Or I mean, it's kind of
All the
all of
above, all of the
it.
above. So, I mean, obviously, China's uh, huge consumer of oil and gas, and they'd love to have indigenous, kind of, Chinese controlled sources versus having to ship everything from the Middle East,
Yeah.
which ties them in there. It is a major, obviously, shipping lanes as far as moving product into East Asia, South Asia, and beyond, right? And so having that kind of shipping control, and if you think about maybe some kind of like blockade by the U.S. or other adversary, uh, China only has one route out, right? And so they would definitely want to control that. So yeah, it's a whole laundry list of why China very much wants to secure this as their own.
Yeah. So, I mean, you already brought it up, but there are a number of countries that either have a territorial claim or are trying to claim these islands: China, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Brunei, probably
Vietnam.
others.
Hmm.
But in at least in modern memory, what I'm thinking of, this hasn't really resulted in significant armed conflict. But over the past decade or so, like you referenced it, these are becoming militarized. There are bases on these islands. Why is this all happening kind of now? Is it just feeling more important now than it has before, or aggressive expansion? What is it?
Yeah, I would say, I think, China has been a rising global power and more adventurous and more assertive. And you start creating friction, right? Because there might have been some kind of normalized agreement, through the UN and others. In fact, the Philippines have taken them to international court and have won, even though nothing actually, came of it. But, so I would just say that it's just, that, China being kind of more assertive and wanting to have control over the South China Sea has created friction. And then all the parties that feel like they own a piece of it are now sitting back saying, we don't want to be kicked to the curb.
Yeah. Yeah, that's understandable. And the United States, I mean, we are somewhat involved tangentially, at least, because of our commitments to the Philippines.
Hmm.
Do you think that if this continues, if this kind of becomes militarized, if this becomes disputed, militarily, would the U.S. deploy troops to kind of, act as a peacekeeper or a decider of who gets the claim there?
Yeah. So the U.S., I would say, State Department and our political leadership, has repeatedly warned the Chinese primarily, but others, that they are obligated to defend the Philippines. They're the oldest treaty ally of the United States in this part of the world, right?
Yeah.
And if Filipino forces, ships, aircraft, whatever, come under fire, the U.S. will step up and support the Philippines in their defense. So yes, that's using Biden's terms, ironclad.
Scary to think of.
And it is, and that's why when I talk to people about this area and what my concerns are, is that every day we have potential aircraft that are tracking, and ships that are out there. One mistake, whether it's Chinese, Russian, or otherwise, that this is all going on all the time, right? And unfortunately, in the last few weeks, a couple of Filipino, I think, if it was a couple or maybe one, but research vessels were out there, and the Chinese, were harassing them and trying to push them back and asking them to leave their territory. And then before that, they had another ship where the Coast Guard was using their fire hoses, the big cannons, and
Yeah.
dousing them with water and in that incident. And so, it's been just that kind of harassment that's been escalating, and a lot of rhetoric, angry rhetoric on both sides. And that's, why we're, I think, here now, why this is a hot topic, is the heat has elevated.
Yeah. But when we say that the heat is elevated, it hasn't, we're not shooting guns or missiles or
No.
things. It's kind of that, you know, bumping one boat off, or like those
Hmm.
water cannons, those kinds of things. But that's still, pretty scary, especially when you're out in the water like that.
So there's quiet enjoyment of freedom of the seas, right? Then there's harassed not enjoyment of freedom of navigation. Now we're having, yes, kinetic, firing a water cannon is an escalation, right? That's, you're potentially damaging the ship, and obviously close enough. That's that, escalation. And at what point does it become ramming, or it does become where they sink one of the ships, right? And then we're in deep.
Yeah. No, that wouldn't be good for anybody. While doing some research for the story, I came across, and I think you mentioned this earlier, that there's some arbitration that happened. I think it was
Hmm.
back in 2016 through the United Nations, and it said that the area was not entitled to this 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone.
Zone. Hmm.
Does an arbitration like that actually have any teeth? I mean, it kind of sounds like the answer is no, but
Yeah. So it has as much teeth as people are willing to abide by it. And if you have one party that doesn't, then what are you going to do? You can take them back to court, right? So
right.
I think it's important that, a little part of the story of this is, we talk about, from China, kind of called the nine dash line,
Right.
right? And this was in 2016. So basically, China took their map and then literally put nine dashes around this area and said that's China,
Right.
and then became adamant that whether it was maps that were in China, or used by Chinese, or whether even passports became a big issue, and there was some tit for tat around that. But they basically have just asserted that that is, their territory, and that's where that tribunal at that time ruled that it had no legal basis to the claim, right?
Yeah.
But from that point on, they've just ignored that, right? And these tit for tats, and harassing other ships, and having, military airplanes out there, that kind of stuff, has all been to basically de facto live with it. This is ours, this nine dash line area of the South China Sea. We're going to build, islands and military bases, and we're going to harass people, and so be it.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you brought up that nine dash line, because I think the reason why I had heard of that was last year in the Barbie movie, of all things. There was a map on
I
screen for a
remember,
minute,
yep,
and there you
in
could
the
see the
background.
lines. Yeah. It's fascinating that something like that can even, break into Barbie and cause an issue, because if
Cause an
I'm
issue on releasing the film in China, right?
yeah, I mean, if I'm looking at that map and I don't know about this, it's just more lines, just a couple dots in the ocean. That didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but now that I know about it,
Yeah.
goodness. And you mentioned, you talked about this, just living with it, because they are like, China is building additional like artificial islands out there
Yep.
to bolster their claim, and putting airports and military bases. Uh, and they're forcing folks to live out there. It doesn't sound like it's, great quality of life while you're you're forced to live out there.
It's just an assignment, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's all seems like it's kind of just posturing, but after a certain period of time,
Mm.
if you've got folks living there, is it theirs? Is it not? I mean, I guess that's the big question about it, right?
Well, again, it makes all of this more complicated,
Yeah.
right, to resolve. And so as they, especially military installations. So then what are you going to do? It's like, these are, like I said, just spread over huge amount of area. And if somebody was going to say, well, we're going to attack China around this, it's like, well, what does that mean? You're going to be attacking a military facility on a man-made island. It's like,
Yeah.
so basically, it's just further escalating and increasing their assertion that this is China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I will borrow Michelle's turn of phrase here about the
Yeah.
looking into that crystal ball, which is,
Mm-hmm.
what do we think? What do you think is the likeliest outcome for this? Because you said we've kind of escalated over the past few years. China's still building, these artificial islands, these bases, all this stuff. I mean, what's going to happen? Is it someone just gonna? Are we gonna start fighting really over it?
So unfortunately, yeah, I'm not seeing any appetite with regard to China to have this like go to arbitration or have this, some tribunal or even to come together and come to some agreement on how to divvy up the goods, right?
Right.
And again, back to my statement in the opening is this is a really tough one. You have a lot of parties involved. That given that it's this dispute is not going to get resolved for a long time,
Yeah.
and that increases the likelihood that an accident or conflict will occur. And why this is what when I'm asked, my top three worldwide, this is in it. So.
Yeah. Now, there is one thing I did want to ask too, which is,
Mm-hmm,
this is a series of islands.
mm-hmm.
Um, is there any situation where this resolves and, somebody gets 2 islands, somebody gets 3 islands, somebody gets a couple, like it's split
Well,
up
that's
as
why
a
I'm saying that if there was some coming together of the parties,
Yeah.
and and they can kind of divvy it up. We did a little bit of that in the Arctic Circle, right?
Right.
um, yeah, that would be a great outcome. But right now, you've got to get all the parties to agree to come and negotiate that. And right now, that's the major player is not opening that door,
Yeah.
to my knowledge.
Nobody wants to be the first to say, yeah, sure. We'll just give this up, because then it becomes,
Right.
why even try? So I want to look at two possible scenarios here,
Okay.
which would be that, either this escalates into a military conflict,
Mm-hmm.
and either A, the United States chooses to not intervene for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
or B, the United States actually does get involved. Which scenario do you think is more likely? And, kind of just game it out from there.
If the Filipino Chinese, does end up in conflict and draw the U.S. in, that would be, where would it escalate to? It probably, I would hope that both parties would say, okay, well, it would be, you're not going to like blow up cities. There, maybe some of these, bases, but at the end of the day, it would just be kind of naval and aircraft picking at each other. So that may be an impetus to say, okay, this has got to get resolved, right?
Right.
Because I don't think neither China nor the U.S., especially right now, for both Xi and Biden, would want to see this escalate into some bigger Chinese U.S. conflict, right? So what I see happening is more, and I don't know which are the scenarios, but that China's just going to continue to build these bases and islands and use their economic might to kind of force people to agree that the 9 dash line, whether it's in a movie or on your passport or whatever, and effectively force them to capitulate and operate under de facto ownership. And I think that's the Chinese are patient, and I think for the foreseeable future, what do they say? Possession is 9 tenths the law, right?
Yeah,
Possession is
exactly.
so.
Well,
Yeah.
it is definitely an area that we will, now that I know more about it, I'm going to keep my eye on it. But hopefully, we won't be back here talking about it soon, because that means that something would be changing, and
Yeah, that would not be good. Yeah.
that would not be good. Well, thank you so much for joining me for the conversation, Bruce. If folks want to get in touch with you and hear more of your insights, where can they find you?
Yeah, at McIndoeRiskAdvisory.com or on LinkedIn or at WTCI.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for tuning in. As always, please visit the World Trade Center Institute online at WTCI.org for more insights, events, and opportunities. And please follow us online at WTC Institute. See you next week.